Welcome to 10 Minute Treasure. My name is Jeff Pospisil. And in this video, I'm going to start looking at the differences between the United Methodist denomination and the Global Methodist denomination purely as an accountant. So I'm not going to get into the theological or the doctrinal debates or all the accusations one way or another. I'm just going to look at it as an accountant because I think there's a lot of lay people that just want to know, what is the cost difference? It's tough enough to be a church as it is. Is one denomination going to make it easier than the other for me just to pay the bills or to pay the salaries or anything like that? So that's my concern for this series. And in this one, I'm going to start by specifically looking at the costs. So what costs am I going to look at? Well, start off, we'll look at the disaffiliation costs. So the cost to leave the United Methodist denomination. And that is going to vary very widely from conference to conference. I'm looking at it from a Dakota's UMC viewpoint. So we have I believe, a very fair and just disaffiliation process as well as the cost. But yours, if you're not in the Dakotas, it'll be quite a bit different. Then I'll look at apportionments, health insurance, and retirement or pension. And those ones within the UMC, those don't vary as much. They will vary, but again, I'm looking at it from Dakota's UMC side, so you would have to adjust it for your own context if you're not in the Dakotas. So not only will costs vary from conference to conference, but they will vary also from church to church. And one of the biggest factors that will impact that cost will be the church's size. And so I'm going to look at 4 different scenarios. So I'm going to look at the small church, that they have a half-time pastor, or maybe they have a full-time pastor that they're sharing equally with another church, and their budget is roughly $50,000. And then I have a medium-sized church, and they have a full-time pastor of their own, and their budget is right around $100,000. And then there is the large church. They have a $250,000 budget, and again, one full-time pastor. They might have other staff, but really, when I'm looking at the costs because I'm looking at health insurance and pension and apportionments, I'm looking at just the clergy that's appointed there. And then you have your supersized church, which might have a senior pastor and an associate pastor and $1 million budget. So, by the way, I'm just using these pictures of the churches as an example. This is not their real finances or anything like that. So let's go into it. All right, let's start by looking at the disaffiliation costs. By the way, I put this date here because I had created a calculator, and I'll put a link to that in the description, that'll help a church estimate the cost of disaffiliation. But really, after this year, it's going to be less and less accurate. So I'm just going to go by the assumption that if a church is deciding to leave, they're going to do it this year. And I know that might not be realistic, but that's what the assumption I'm going with. So for a United Methodist church, if you are committing to the denomination, guess what? You get a very good price. It costs you nothing to stay. Or nothing for disaffiliation costs to stay. So very good price. Now, if you are planning on leaving, and no matter if you go to the Global Methodist or some other denomination, there is going to be the cost. And one of the things you're going to see in the calculator is that you have to be current on your apportionments. So I'm going under the assumption that you're a church that's, if you're thinking about leaving, that you're current on your apportionments. So you might have to factor that in as well. So for a small church, it'll cost roughly $15,000, medium church $30,000, large church $35,000, supersized church $85,000. So that's what the numbers are as of today, roughly. If the pension happens to double, pension liability, because that's greatly affected by markets and the number of people that are covered, that could easily jump for the small church to 25, medium church up to maybe 55, large church maybe 60, and supersized church 135 or something like that. So that'll give you an idea of maybe the upper end of what the disaffiliation costs could be, at least as the process is currently. I mean, that process also could change. I know we're living into it, and we'll see what happens, but at least as of 2022, that's what the process is. All right, so now let's look at apportionments. And I think they call it something different in the Global Methodist Church. I think it's connectional funding. but apportionments for United Methodist, connectional funding for Global Methodist, and I'm using the 2023 year. So for Dakota's UMC, it's a simple math where you just multiply your operating income by the percentage. And for 2023, it happens to be 14%. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So if you look at the supersized church, $1 million times 14% is 140,000. For the small church, it's 50,000 times 14% is 7,000. So that gives you that idea. For the Global Methodist denomination, it'll be 2% for 2023. So 1% goes to the Global Methodist denomination, the general church part, and I think 1% goes to the conference. And I think that the goal behind that is that they recognize churches would have spent quite a bit to disaffiliate, so there's that idea of trying to recover their costs. So for a small church, it would cost $1,000. For a supersized church, it would cost $20,000. So that should give you a good idea. Now the apportionments, they're going to change from year to year. And so let's go ahead and look into the future. So for the Dakota's United Methodist, their plan is to work their way down to 10%. And that will be a struggle, but I'm going to go under the assumption that that's the path that they are going down. So they're going to go down 1% per year until they get down to 10%. So in 2024, it'll be 13%. And so every church gets their apportionments go down a notch. And for the Global Methodist, it's going to stay at 2% until they have their convening conference. And at that time, then there'll be an adjustment in the apportionment amount after the convening conference. But the convening conference, I think, is going to happen in 2024. So the first time they have real apportionments without this cost recovery will be in 2025. All right, in 2025, the Dakota's UMC should be planning on taking another step down to 12%. And for the Global Methodist, I use their transitional book of doctrines and discipline, and there they list out the max apportionment, connectional funding of 6.5%. So I just went with that assumption is that they're going to hit that max number of 6.5%. So this would be their apportionment going forward. And again, with both of these, there's a lot of moving parts, and this is at least the best guess right now based on the information we know. And then we get to 2026, and the Dakota's UMC takes another step down to 11%, and the Global Methodist should be at that same rate, that 6.5%. All right, that gets us to 2027, and hopefully by that time now, the Dakota's UMC is at a tithe or 10%, and the Global Methodist, they might be around 6.5% still. One of the toughest things to predict, though, is both these denominations. They're going to be going through massive changes, and it's pretty easy for an institution to want to go into self-preservation mode. So the Global Methodists, they're going to be trying to build stuff up. The United Methodists, they're going to be trying to preserve things. And so it'll be interesting to see which wins out, the local church or the institution of the conference or the denomination. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind as the further you go out, the harder it is to get accurate numbers. But at least this is where they are trending or where they say they're going to go. All right, so let's go to health insurance. And by the way, you see the number is 2023 still. And one of the things for the Global Methodists, I don't think their health insurance plan will start until 2023. So if a pastor leaves before the end of the year, they're going to have to figure something out. So it might even just be continuing their policy for a couple months. But either way, that's something to think about. In the Dakota's UMC, it's roughly $14,000. So for a small church, if you're sharing your pastor, you'd only have your share of that cost. If you have multiple pastors, you pay multiple times that 14. For the Global Methodist denomination, it's going to be roughly the same. I mean, there will be some variations from region to region, but roughly the same as what I've heard the costs are. And again, it's through Westpath, the same as the United Methodist. And then we look at the retirement or pension. And you are going to see a pretty big difference here because although Westpath is going to be serving both denominations, the United Methodist Church, because of the delay in General Conference, um, they have not been able to update their plan. So they're stuck with the old CRSP plan, which is roughly 75% years of service or a defined benefit plan, and then the rest of it's defined contribution plan. And the Global Methodist is 100% defined contribution. Both denominations want to move away from that defined benefit piece because you tend to get in trouble with that pension liability. So, looking at the UMC side, these are going to be roughly what the numbers are. Again, it is going to matter on how much your pastor is paid. So that's why there's a difference between the medium and the large church. Chances are the large church is compensating their pastor by a little bit more. And then when we look at the Global Methodists, theirs is based on compensation. So it's a percentage of compensation. And the cost you're going to see, there is a difference there. But that's only temporary. The difference will go pretty much away when the General Conference is able to meet. And I think it's 2026 when the new plan is going to be able to be adopted by the United Methodist. So it's called Compass. So as you can see, by 2026, the numbers are going to be very similar. I mean, there is going to be a little bit of a difference. And the cause of that difference is that the death and disability coverage for the Global Methodist will be just a little bit cheaper. So anyway, those are the numbers for the retirement and pension. All right. So what I decided to do was just put it all together. I was debating on whether I should do a graph or what, but I had developed this spreadsheet for a class that I was teaching, and I figured I would use it for this purpose to think of this as if a church was going to decide whether or not to disaffiliate, if it was just purely an investment decision. So that's, and again, that's not what this is, but that's what we were going to look at it for. If we were just trying to save money or increase income. So as you can see, I have my small, medium, large, and supersized churches here. The initial investment, that should correspond with what we already talked about: 15,000, 30,000, 35,000, 85,000. So that's the disaffiliation cost. And then what I did is I just did the math. I showed you all the differences in apportionments and health insurance, as well as the difference in pension. And if we go ahead and add those numbers in there, and I just did it for 5 years. The farther you go out, I mean, we could go further out. It's just these ones here, and maybe we'll do that in a little bit. But the farther you go out, the less certain it is. Just the less certain it is. And so the big question is, where would you be getting this money? So, because that ends up being the cost of capital, which is a percentage. So let's just say, for example, our cost of capital is, we have it in a CD and we're making 1%. Let's just go with that. 1%. So what we would be doing is, if we were trying to evaluate this as an investment decision, we would want to see that our rate of return, which is right here, is greater than 1%. Also, if the net present value is positive, that's also tells you if it's a good investment decision. So for here, you could see if the small church decides to disaffiliate and it costs them $15,000, they end up getting, over the next 5 years, a 29% return. And again, for the medium, it's 29%. Large church, it's 83.9%. And then the supersized church, they end up getting 135% return. So if you actually look at it, a church that leaves that small, by the time 2 years go by, they've covered that cost. So, and then for same thing for a church that's medium. With a large church, just by the end of that first year, they've ended up recovering their cost. And then for a supersized church, they recover that cost by like September is what it looks like. Okay, so let's tweak it a little bit. So even if you have, let's say you have your money invested with the Methodist Foundation and you're getting on average about 7.5%. We look at that. These numbers are still positive. Actually, you'd have to go up to 30% before they start turning negative. Anyway, but that'll also give you an idea. But there's a lot of other factors too. So one factor might be, let's say you don't have a pastor on benefits. That's going to change these numbers then. So if you're, let's just say you're that small church and you don't have a pastor on the pension program or on the health program, I did the math for these, but I'm going to plug it in. And so your return is much smaller now. You can see that's about a 9% return. So quite a bit smaller. It still would technically be a better investment decision. But let's just say, for example, that the one moving number is that pension number, which changes from time to time as the assets go up and down, and as the number of people, the lives covered usually goes down. So, but how much it goes down. So I'm just going to go ahead and double that number. So 12,500 for the small church, 25,000 for the medium-sized church, also 25,000 for the large church, and an extra 50,000 for the supersized church. And so now you can see how that is not a good investment decision for, I mean, yeah, it ends up getting a negative return for these churches, the small and the medium-sized churches. And then the large church and the supersized church, they still get a return after 5 years. And if you wanted to, you can probably draw this out to 10 years. But the farther you go out, again, the more uncertainty there is. It's hard to, I mean, you're not even going to have the same leadership in either denomination. You're going to have a couple of general conferences in there. Things could radically change. And so, but even for that, the small church, if that pension would double, it's going to take a very long time for them to recover that cost. So they wouldn't even recover it all the way after 10 years. It would actually take 11 years to recover that. So that's just a little bit of a analysis this way if this was purely an investment decision, which of course it is not. All right, so that brings us to the end. Hopefully that was helpful. And by the way, as important as I think the costs are, I'm a chief accountant. The costs are very important, but it also matters on what the benefits you get. And so I am going to focus on that one in the next video in this series. I will also put a link to that spreadsheet I used to show the cost recovery and the return on investment. I'll include that in the description as well. All right, till next time, God bless.